So let's continue in our quest down memory lane. Going to expand on talking about the historical elements of higher education in the United States with particular focus to the field of student affairs now. So in this video, I'm going to provide a brief overview of some of the direct underpinnings of the development of student affairs. And as I mentioned in the video on the historical underpinnings from kind of the broad perspective of the history of higher education in the United States, faculty were concerned more with monitoring students than with actual teaching. But their duties extended beyond proctoring in the classrooms, and faculty were really responsible for the entirety of student life in the early days of higher education. So the 17th century and really all of the 18th century and uh, in fact most of the 19th century. So for a significant portion of the history of higher education in this country, faculty were responsible for both in-class monitoring and then became in-class instruction, and are also responsible for any store student discipline, for monitoring students in the dining halls, and so forth. And so again, I'm going to provide a little bit of my bias for the University of South Carolina, and both of these pictures are represent South Carolina College in the 19th century. So the picture of the top is actually from one of the original classrooms. Now, obviously, the seating would have been different years ago, but what looks like a judge's bench at the front of the room is actually where the proctor would be seated. And the students would come up one by one and recite whatever passages were part of the lesson for the day. And remember from the last video, the classical curriculum of Greek, Latin, and mathematics. And so they would recite various elements. And then the picture at the bottom of the campus, you can see that there is a wall, a brick wall at the bottom, and it went around the entire campus. And one of the funny things is sometimes when we see pictures of campuses from this time period, or even visit campuses that existed during that time, and we see walls around the original portion of the campus, we think, oh boy, they were really protective of students. Well, the wall actually served a different purpose, at least in the case of South Carolina College. That brick wall was constructed in order to keep the bad students in, not to keep any bad influences out. There are a lot of fascinating tales from institutions of this time period, and South Carolina College being just one of them. And so I really enjoy kind of looking at some of those historical elements and kind of thinking about what that piece of history means to how we approach the student experience in 21st century higher education in the United States. So as the faculty role was quickly changing toward the end of the 19th century, and there was an ever-increasing desire to shift faculty work away from the day-to-day management of students, it was recognized there was a need for an administrator dedicated to these tasks. In 1890, LeBaron Russell Briggs was named the Dean of Men at Harvard and is recognized as the first person to hold such a position. While certainly the predecessor to modern-day student affairs staff and current deans of students, Dr. Briggs was not focused on enhancing student learning or the idea of what we call today the co-curriculum. He and the hundreds of other deans of men who quickly followed around the country were concerned with maintaining order. It would actually be quite some time before student affairs as we know it today would emerge with its focus on holistic learning and development. What is now the National Association of Student Personnel Administrators, or NASPA, began in 1919 under the name of National Association of Deans and Advisors of Men. It's not a coincidence that Alice Freeman Palmer was named the first dean of women in 1892. It was right around 1890 that institutions that had previously been limited to male enrollment began enrolling women, although in very small numbers. Enrolling women actually presented a number of challenges. First, any on-campus residences were inhabited by men and featured common bathrooms shared by all the residents of a floor or hall. This actually gave rise to a cottage industry of boarding houses in college towns. Remember the reason for those walls around college campuses in the earlier part of the 19th century? Well, student behavior hadn't improved that drastically by the 1890s, so there were certainly concerns about the well-being of women enrolling in what had been men's only spaces. The first deans of women performed a role that was different from deans of men and much more akin to what we know today as student affairs. So formal training in student affairs began with the first graduate degree program in student personnel services at Columbia University's Teachers College. The first master's degree was awarded in 1917 and the first doctoral degree in 1929. To date, there are graduate programs in higher education and student affairs at a little better than 200 institutions in the United States and a few interspersed throughout Canada. The initial programs were focused on admissions officers and academic advisors. What is now the American College Personnel Association, or ACPA, began in 1924 as the National Association of Appointment Secretaries. So one of the things that distinguishes student affairs as a field of practice is a well-developed sense of principles and documented principles. And the first of those came about in 1937 in a document called The Student Personnel Point of View. And its role is significant. And so this document, as I said, was published in 1937 and then revised in 1949 and really serve as key foundations for establishing a coherent profession and set the groundwork for what would become student affairs attention to the educational and developmental needs of the whole student. During the second half of the 20th century, a lot of changes to American higher education came about that had profound and direct impacts on student affairs. With the passage of the Servicemen's Readjustment Act, referred to as the GI Bill, thousands of veterans returning from World War II began in colleges and universities across the country. This meant a need for increased student housing, which brought about increases in co-curricular options to try to meet the demands of a larger student population. The Civil Rights era ushered in tremendous changes in terms of access and diversity. Student affairs professionals were looked to for ideas to help address the needs of a student body that was changing very rapidly. In addition to the civil rights movement, the 1960s heralded significant changes in student affairs. In addition to the civil rights movement, the 1960s heralded significant changes in student affairs. From the beginning of higher education in America, parents sent their children to college with the expectation that the faculty and staff would serve in place of the parents, known as in loco parentis. As you might imagine, men and women who enrolled in college after serving in the military during a war weren't too keen on being treated as children. Also, societal changes of the 1950s and 1960s led students to assert their rights as adults, bringing end to in loco parentis in the late 1960s and early 1970s. However, don't think that institutions simply let go of in loco parentis in response to seeing student changes in the surrounding society. Student activism was one of the key driving forces, along with some key court cases. Founded in 1979, the Council for the Advancement of Standards in Higher Education, or CAS, is the preeminent force for promoting standards in student affairs, student services, and student development programs. CAS continues to create and deliver a dynamic and credible book of professional standards and guidelines and self-assessment guides that are designed to lead to a host of quality-controlled programs and services. The ultimate purpose of CAS is to foster and enhance student learning, development, and achievement, and to promote good citizenship. CAS standards respond to real-time student needs, the requirements of sound pedagogy, and the effective management of more than 40 functional areas consistent with institutional missions. What CAS provides is self-monitoring of adherence to professional standards, a set of agreed-upon benchmarks. CAS standards give student affairs units a common measuring stick, but also a set of goals to strive toward reaching. I want to go ahead and mention the CAS standards here as part of the development of student affairs because you're going to need to draw on the CAS standards, and I provide these documents in the Canvas course in order to address the operationalizing series of papers.